The letter arrived on a Tuesday in April of 1873, which was, as far as Maggie Fairchild could tell, the same day her life stopped belonging to her. She had been standing in the parlor of her uncle's house in Cincinnati when her aunt pressed the folded paper into her hands with the particular expression of someone delivering news they had already decided was good. The parlor smelled of lemon oil and old ambition, and the afternoon light came through the lace curtains in pale stripes across the floor, and Maggie had read the letter twice before she fully understood what it said. Her cousin Eleanor was supposed to go west. Eleanor had agreed to the arrangement herself, had answered the advertisement in the Cincinnati Gazette with careful penmanship and high hopes, had exchanged 3 months of letters with a rancher in the New Mexico territory named Ira Norris. And then Eleanor had met a banker's son at a Sunday social, fallen promptly and completely in love, and announced that she would not be traveling anywhere that required crossing the Missouri River, which left the family in a difficulty. They had given their word. The arrangements were made, a train ticket had been purchased, and Ira Norris, whoever he was expecting a wife. Maggie was 23 years old, unmarried, and had been living in her uncle's house since her parents died of typhoid fever 2 years prior. She had no money of her own. She had a small trunk of belongings, a good mind that no one had found particularly useful, and the growing awareness that she occupied a space in the Fairchild household that was tolerated rather than celebrated. When her aunt said, "It would be a wonderful opportunity for you, Margaret," what she meant was that Maggie was convenient. When her uncle said, "The man seems respectable enough," what he meant was that the problem needed solving and Maggie was the solution that was available. She was not asked. She was informed. And because she had nowhere else to go, and because she was tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep, she said yes. She packed her trunk in an afternoon. She said goodbye to a household that wished her well with the cheerful efficiency of people watching a problem resolve itself. And on a Wednesday morning in late April of 1873, Maggie Fairchild boarded a train heading west with a second-hand valise, $40 hidden in the lining of her corset, and absolutely no idea what she was walking into. The train journey took 4 days, and Maggie spent most of it watching the landscape change through the window with the focused attention of someone trying to memorize something before it disappears. Ohio gave way to Indiana, which gave way to Missouri, and then the great flat openness of Kansas arrived and kept arriving, mile after mile of prairie sky so large and so blue that it pressed against the chest like a hand. She had never seen anything like it. She had grown up in cities, had lived her whole life under roofs and between buildings, and the sheer enormousness of the western sky made her feel both terrified and, unexpectedly, something closer to free. She reached Santa Fe on a Saturday evening when the sun was already sitting low, and the light had turned that particular shade of amber that made everything look like the inside of a lantern. The town was louder than she had expected, full of the sounds of horses and iron, and a dozen different languages, the streets churning with the particular energy of a place that was still deciding what it wanted to become. She stood on the platform with her trunk and her valise and the letter that had been written to Eleanor, and looked around for someone who might be looking for her. He was leaning against a post at the far end of the platform. She knew it was him the way you sometimes know things without being told, the same way you know weather is coming before the clouds arrive. He was tall, not uncommonly so, but tall in the way of a man who had spent years outdoors and had simply grown to fit the space available to him. He had dark hair going to gray at the temples, though he could not have been much older than 30, and a face that had been weathered to something that was past handsome and arrived at interesting. He was wearing a brown coat and a hat that had seen better years, and he was holding his own hat in one hand with the absent-minded grip of a man who had taken it off out of habit and forgotten he was holding it. He was scanning the platform with an expression that was carefully neutral but not quite, the way a man looks when he is trying not to appear as anxious as he actually is. Maggie picked up her valise and walked toward him. "Mr. Norris," she said. He looked at her. His eyes were the color of the sky above the flat Kansas prairie, a sort of clear, light gray blue that seemed designed for distance. He looked at her for a moment that went on one beat too long, and then something shifted in his expression, not disappointment exactly, but recalibration. "Miss Fairchild," he said. His voice was low and deliberate, the voice of a man who said things because he meant them and not simply because the silence needed filling. "I should tell you something," Maggie said, because she had decided on the train that she was not going to begin whatever this was with dishonesty. "I am not the Miss Fairchild you corresponded with. I am her cousin. She was meant to come and then she wasn't, and I was sent in her place. I understand if that changes things." He absorbed this information with the stillness of a man who had learned to be unsurprised by the ways in which plans fell apart. Then he said, "Are you her in any meaningful sense?" Maggie blinked. "I'm sorry." "The letters," he said, "were they honest about what she was, what she wanted, what kind of life she was willing to live?" Maggie thought about this seriously because it was a serious question. "I read the letters before I came," she said. "I wanted to know what you expected. She was honest about wanting a quiet life and hard work. She was honest about not knowing much about ranching. She was not honest about being in love with someone else." "That last part is the important one," Ira Norris said, and something very faint moved across his face that might have been the beginning of a different kind of look. "Are you in love with anyone else?" "No," Maggie said. "Then we can work with this," he said. He picked up her trunk as if it weighed nothing, which it did not. It weighed quite a lot, and he carried it toward a wagon waiting at the edge of the street. "The minister is available Sunday if that suits you." "I would like a few days first," Maggie said, following him, "to see the land and understand what I'm agreeing to." He stopped and turned around. "That's fair," he said. "I'll put you up at Mrs. Crane's boarding house in town. You can come out to the ranch and look it over before you decide." Maggie felt something loosen in her chest. She had not known until that moment how tightly she had been holding herself against the possibility that he would simply refuse her the right to choose. "Thank you," she said, and she meant it with more weight than the words usually carried. He nodded once and kept walking, and Maggie followed him into the amber evening of Santa Fe with her valise in her hand, and the strange, vertiginous feeling of a woman standing at the very beginning of a story that might go any number of ways. Mrs. Crane's boarding house was clean and narrow and smelled of pine soap and something baking, and the woman who ran it was a widow of 60, with a precise manner and sharp eyes that missed nothing. She showed Maggie to a small room on the second floor with a window that looked out over the street, and when Ira Norris paid for 3 nights in advance without being asked, Mrs. Crane gave him a look that Maggie could not entirely interpret but which seemed to contain approval. "He's a good man," Mrs. Crane said when he had gone. "Quiet, keeps to himself more than is probably healthy, but good." "How long has he been here?" Maggie asked. 6 years, came out from Virginia after the war. Bought the Callaway land when old Callaway died and the widow couldn't manage it. Built it into something real." She paused. "He's had a hard time of it, not in any dramatic way. Just the ordinary hard time of a man alone." Maggie thought about that as she unpacked her trunk. Outside the window, Santa Fe was settling into the particular noise of a western town at nightfall, horses and laughter, and the distant sound of a piano being played with more enthusiasm than skill, and above all of it, the enormous, indifferent sky beginning to fill with more stars than she had ever seen in her life. She had been sent west as an afterthought. She stood at the window and looked up at all those stars and thought that she was going to make something of this regardless, because she had nothing else and she was not a person who could do nothing. The next morning Ira Norris arrived at Mrs. Crane's boarding house at 8 o'clock with a buckboard and 2 bay horses named Cedar and Jack, which he informed Maggie of without being asked, in the tone of a man who thought the names of horses were basic information that anyone should have. Maggie climbed up onto the seat without assistance, which appeared to mildly surprise him, and they drove out of town on a road that was more suggestion than fact, cutting through scrubland and red dust, and the occasional stand of cottonwood that clustered along the dry creek beds like old men sharing secrets. He did not talk much on the ride out, but what he did say was interesting. He pointed out the line of mountains to the north and named them. He explained the particular quality of the soil in different stretches of the land and what grew best in each. He mentioned, almost in passing, that there had been Apache trouble 2 years prior, but that the situation had shifted since then, and that his neighbors, the Ray's family, had been on this land for 4 generations and knew more about surviving it than anyone else in the territory. Maggie listened to all of this carefully and asked questions, and he answered them without condescension, which she noticed and appreciated. The ranch came into view around a bend in the road, and Maggie felt her breath catch in a way that surprised her. It was not grand. She had not expected grand, but it was real in a way that the word ranch had not prepared her for. There was a main house of adobe and timber that sat low against the landscape as if it had grown there, with a wide porch facing south and a kitchen garden along the east wall that was just beginning to show green. Beyond it, a barn in good repair, several outbuildings and corrals where horses moved with the easy grace of animals that were well kept. The land rolled away in every direction toward the mountains, and the light on it in the morning was extraordinary, turning everything gold and lavender and honest. "It's beautiful," Maggie said, before she could weigh whether that was appropriate. Ira Norris looked at the land the way you look at something you have built with your own hands over a long time, the way you look at something that cost you more than you can easily count. "It's getting there," he said. He showed her the house. It was plain and functional, and there were signs everywhere of a man living alone, the single coffee cup, the shelf of books that had been read multiple times, the kitchen with its careful arrangement of limited supplies. The bedroom he would give her was small and south-facing, and the window was clouded with dust, but the light came through it like something warm and intentional. There was a second room, his. "I'm not asking you to be my wife in any sense until you're willing," he said, and his voice did not change register when he said it, which was either remarkable discipline or simply his nature. "The arrangement is what you want it to be." "I appreciate that," Maggie said. "I'm practical about it," he said. "I need someone who can manage a household and help with the work. You need a home and a future. We can build something from that if we're both willing to work. If it becomes something more, that's up to both of us." It was possibly the most unromantic statement of intention Maggie had ever heard, and she found it, to her own surprise, enormously comforting. He was not pretending. He was not performing. He was simply telling her the truth of the situation and offering her the dignity of making her own decision about it. "I'll marry you on Sunday," she said. Something shifted in his face, something small and quick that she almost missed. "Good," he said. They were married on Sunday by the minister at the small whitewashed church on the south end of town, with Mrs. Crane and a ranch hand named Delgado standing as witnesses. Maggie wore her best dress, which was blue and somewhat travel-worn, and Ira Norris wore a clean shirt and a jacket that fit him well, and his hat, which he removed when they stepped into the church and did not replace until they stepped back out. The minister was a cheerful man named Father Thomas, who said the words with genuine feeling, as if he had not said them hundreds of times before. When Ira Norris put the ring on her finger, it was a simple gold band, plain and substantial, and his hands were large and steady and warm, and Maggie looked up at him and found him looking down at her with an expression she could not entirely read, but which was not indifferent. It was something careful, something attentive, the look of a man paying serious attention. She thought, standing there in the small church with the desert light flooding through the high windows, that she had no idea what she had married, and that she was not, specifically, afraid of that. They drove back to the ranch in the afternoon. Delgado, the ranch hand, had left a meal in the kitchen, which was either his own initiative or a suggestion from Ira, and they ate together at the kitchen table with the windows open, and the smell of sage and warm earth coming through. Ira poured coffee from the pot on the stove and set a cup in front of her without asking if she wanted it, which she did, and the small assumption of it felt like the first real thing between them, the first moment of ordinary knowledge. "Tell me about Virginia," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Not much to tell," he said, which was clearly not true but was also clearly a statement about what he was willing to offer. "Tell me what you're willing to," she said. He looked at her across the table. Then he said, "I had a farm before the war, worked it with my father and my brother. After the war, there wasn't enough of us left to make it work and the land was finished anyway. I came west because there was nothing keeping me east." "Your brother," she said. "Killed at the Wilderness," he said. "May of '64. "I'm sorry," she said. "Yes," he said, and the word had weight without drama. "My parents died of typhoid," she offered. 2 years ago, that's why I was at my uncle's house." He nodded. "That's hard," he said. And he said it simply, without embroidery, and somehow that simplicity was more comforting than any elaborate expression of sympathy would have been. They finished their meal. Outside, the evening was coming down in great sweeps of color across the desert sky, orange and pink and deep violet, and the horses in the corral were settling. Maggie washed the dishes and Ira brought in wood for the morning, and they moved around each other in the kitchen with the careful courtesy of people sharing a space they don't yet fully know how to share, and it was not uncomfortable, exactly. It was the feeling of something still finding its shape. "I'll be up before dawn," he said, at the bedroom door. His room was on one side of the narrow hallway and hers on the other. "The horses need feeding by 5:30. You don't need to be up that early." "What needs doing in the morning that I can help with?" she asked. He looked at her. "You want to help in the mornings?" "I'm not here to sit in the house," she said. Something moved across his face again. That small, careful movement. "The chickens need feeding and the eggs need gathering. Kitchen garden needs watering before the sun gets high. Coffee needs to be on by 6. "I can do that," she said. "All right," he said. "Good night, Miss Fair." He stopped. "Mrs. Norris." The name settled over her like something new and not entirely uncomfortable. "Good night, Mr. Norris," she said. She lay in the dark in her new room and listened to the sounds of the New Mexico night, which were entirely different from any sound she had grown up with. The coyotes in the distance, the wind moving through the cottonwoods, the settling sounds of the house itself. And she thought about the man on the other side of the hallway who had received her, a stranger sent in place of a stranger, with a quiet dignity that she had not expected and could not stop thinking about. She was asleep before she could complete the thought. The first week was a curriculum. Maggie was not a woman who allowed herself to be passive in the face of the unknown, and the ranch was almost entirely unknown to her. She had grown up in the city. She had never properly ridden a horse. She had never grown food or cured anything or managed water from a well. She had never dealt with the particular arithmetic of Western survival, the constant calculation of water and weather and distance and supply. She made mistakes. She overwatered the kitchen garden twice and underwatered it once. She dropped an egg every morning for the first 4 days. She burned the cornbread on Tuesday and the beans on Thursday, and on Friday she got turned around in the south pasture and had to be found by Ira, who rode out on Cedar and located her standing at the base of a scrub oak looking at the mountains with the composure of someone who had decided that panicking was not a useful response to being lost. "The mountains are always north," he said, riding up beside her. "I know that now," she said. "You were headed south," he said. "I also know that now," she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then the corner of his mouth moved. It was not quite a smile, not yet, but it was the place where a smile might eventually grow if given time and the right conditions. "Come on," he said. "Supper's not going to make itself." She rode back behind him on Cedar, holding his waist with a pragmatism that neither of them acknowledged, and she felt the warmth of him through his shirt and the steadiness of him against the horse's movement. And she thought that steadiness was a quality she had not valued enough before because she had never been in sufficient need of it. By the second week, she had stopped dropping eggs. By the third week, she had learned to read the morning sky for weather and to bank the fire properly, and to make the particular stew that Delgado had left the recipe for, which required dried chili and patience in equal measure. She learned the horses, all four of them, Cedar and Jack and a gray mare named Patience and a young sorrel that didn't have a name yet. "Does he need one?" she asked, looking at the sorrel over the fence. "Probably," Ira said. "I'll think about it," she said. She named him Prospect 3 days later, partly because of the color and partly because of the feeling she had about him, that he was something coming towards something, and Ira said, "That's a good name," without any of the condescension she might have expected from a man who had been naming horses for 6 years. They developed routines. He was up before dawn and she was up not long after. They had coffee together in the kitchen in the early morning before the day properly began, and those were the times when they talked the most, in the particular honesty that comes with half-darkness and the first warmth of coffee, and the sense that the day had not yet made its demands. She learned that he had opinions about water rights and the territorial government, and the particular injustice of the land-grant system that had displaced Mexican families who had been farming the land for generations. She learned that he read everything he could get his hands on, and that he corresponded with a man in Santa Fe who ran the land office, and who kept him informed of developments that might affect the ranch. He learned that she had strong opinions about nearly everything and the habit of saying them, which surprised him at first, and then seemed to interest him. He learned that she could do arithmetic faster in her head than most men could on paper, which he found practically useful almost immediately when a horse trader came by and tried to swindle them on a saddle exchange. She caught the bad arithmetic before the man had finished speaking, named the correct figure, and watched the trader's expression pass through several unflattering stages. After the trader left, Ira stood beside her looking at the road with that almost smile. "How did you do that?" he asked. "Numbers have always made sense to me," she said, "more than most things." "That's a gift," he said, and he said it as if he meant it completely, as if the gift of a woman's mind was not a thing to be embarrassed by or managed, but simply a fact to be valued. She thought about that for a long time. The social life of the territory was nothing like what she had grown up with. There were no parlors, no calling cards, no elaborate rituals of introduction. There were church Sundays and occasional dances at the schoolhouse, and the market that happened in Santa Fe on the last Saturday of the month. And at all of these events, she met the people who made up the world she had married into. She met Delgado's family, his wife Rosa, who was warm and practical and brought Maggie a jar of preserved peaches on the second week, and taught her how to make tortillas by showing her 3 times without ever suggesting that she was slow to learn. She met the Reyes family, who ran cattle on the land to the west, and had a patriarch named Don Eduardo, who was 72 years old, and had lived through more history than most people could imagine: the Mexican-American War, the Civil War years, the slow encroachment of Anglo settlement on land that his grandfather had farmed before any of it was American territory. Don Eduardo spoke English precisely, and with a formality that Maggie recognized as the particular formality of a man speaking a language that was not his own, but has decided to speak it well. He assessed her over the fence at their first meeting with the direct appraisal of a man who has learned not to waste time, and then he said something to Ira in Spanish that made Ira's almost smile appear again. "What did he say?" Maggie asked, on the way home. Ira was quiet for a moment. "He said you have good eyes," he said. He meant it as a compliment. "What kind of eyes?" she asked. "The kind that actually look at what's there," he said. She thought about that for a long time, too. It was in the 5th week that the trouble arrived. His name was Chester Doyle, and he rode into the territory from the east with a deed that he claimed gave him rights to the water from the upper creek that ran along the north boundary of Ira's land. The deed was recent, dated that winter, and it bore the signature of a land commissioner in Santa Fe who was known to have connections to the railroad speculation that was currently consuming most of the eastern interest in the territory. Ira came in from the fence line one evening with the deed in his hand, and his face arranged in the particular stillness of a man controlling a response that he does not want to display. He set the paper on the kitchen table and sat down with his coffee, and Maggie looked at him for a moment and then looked at the deed. She read it carefully, then she read it again. "The date on this recording is wrong," she said. He looked at her. "What?" "The recording date. It says February 14th, but the notarization is dated February 16th. A recording can't precede the notarization it's based on. The document is either falsified or was recorded using a prior undated draft, which would make the recording itself invalid." She looked up. "Do you have your original deed?" He got up from the table and went to the small locked box he kept in the bottom drawer of the wardrobe in his room, and came back with a document that was older and more worn and entirely in order. She compared the two. "Your water rights are specified in the 1867 land grant," she said. "This newer deed doesn't supersede a prior grant. It would need to specifically reference and invalidate it, which it doesn't do. This deed is trying to claim rights without acknowledging that you already have them." Ira sat back in his chair and looked at her with an expression that was different from anything she had seen on his face before. It was not the almost smile. It was something more open, something that had not had time to become careful yet. "How do you know this?" he asked. "My father was a lawyer," she said. "Before he died, I used to read his papers." "You understand property law," he said. "I understand the language of property law," she corrected. "I'm not a lawyer, but I know what I'm looking at." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What do I do with this?" "You take both deeds to Santa Fe, and you find a lawyer who isn't connected to the land commissioner," she said. "And you file an objection to the recording date before Doyle can establish any precedent." They went to Santa Fe the next day. Maggie had found the name of a lawyer in the Gazette advertisement section, a man named Hollis Pratt, who billed himself as independent of railroad interests, which in 1873 was either a genuine virtue or a marketing strategy, but which proved in this case to be true. Pratt examined both documents, confirmed Maggie's analysis with the brisk efficiency of a man who was used to being the only one in the room who could read a deed, and was pleasantly surprised to find that someone had done the work before him, and filed the objection that afternoon. Chester Doyle came to the ranch 2 days later, riding a horse that was better than his manner deserved, and he spoke to Ira with the particular confidence of a man who assumed his money would solve any problem that his power did not. He was perhaps 45, heavy-shouldered, with the look of someone who had built himself up in the world by a combination of aggression and finding the people who would yield to it. Maggie came out onto the porch when she heard the voices. Doyle looked at her with the expression men sometimes used when they were deciding whether a woman was a relevant presence. He decided she was not. "Your wife," he said to Ira, the way someone says your dog. "Yes," Ira said. His voice had gone very flat. "Nice," Doyle said, in a tone that made the word mean the opposite of something kind. Then he went back to talking about the deed and the water rights and his intention to fence the creek access unless Ira was willing to pay a usage fee. And as he talked, Maggie stood on the porch and felt something cold and clear settle over her like the shadow of a cloud. She had seen men like Doyle in Cincinnati. She knew their arithmetic, which was the arithmetic of people who counted only what they owned and not what they owed. She knew their confidence, which was the confidence of men who had never been wrong in a way that they had to live with. "Mr. Doyle," she said. He looked at her. He did it slowly, the way you turn to acknowledge something you've decided is not worth your full attention. "The objection to your deed recording was filed 2 days ago in Santa Fe," she said. "The filing establishes that your recording date cannot precede the notarization, which makes the precedence of your claim invalid. The water rights in the 1867 grant are currently the operative legal instrument. You are welcome to pursue the matter further." but I would suggest that your lawyer explain to you the difference between a valid deed and a document with recording irregularities before you invest more in this position." The silence that followed was of the particular quality that exists after someone has said something that cannot be unsaid and the room is deciding what to do with it. Doyle looked at her, then at Ira, then at her again, and this time the look he gave her was different, the look of a man who has miscalculated the size of what is in front of him. "Is she right?" he asked Ira. "She's right," Ira said. Doyle took a long breath. Then he said, "I'll be consulting my lawyer," and rode away without another word. He did consult his lawyer, and his lawyer apparently told him something similar to what Maggie had said, because the matter was dropped 3 weeks later when the land commissioner whose signature appeared on the deed was found to have been involved in 3 other irregular recordings and was quietly removed from his position. It was not a dramatic resolution. Nobody was arrested or run out of town. The wrong was corrected through the tedious and ordinary machinery of the legal process, which was not satisfying but was at least effective. Ira came in from the barn the evening he got the news from Holly's Pratt, and he found Maggie in the kitchen making biscuits, which she had finally gotten right after 2 weeks of practice. He stood in the doorway for a moment and she looked up and read his face. "It's settled," she said. "It's settled," he said. She nodded and went back to the biscuits. He came into the kitchen and poured himself coffee and stood there watching her work, and she was aware of him watching and was aware that she did not mind it, that the awareness of his presence in the kitchen was something that had over the past weeks become one of the reliable things, one of the things that shaped the days. "Maggie," he said. It was the first time he had used her given name. Not Miss Fairchild, not Mrs. Norris, Maggie. She looked up. He was looking at her with that open expression again, the one that had not had time to become careful. "Thank you," he said, "not just for the deed, for all of it." "The deed was the easy part," she said. "What was the hard part?" he asked. She thought about it honestly. "Figuring out what kind of person I was supposed to be here," she said. "What was mine to contribute and what wasn't. I didn't want to come in and presume." "You haven't presumed," he said. "You've helped." "I'm glad," she said, and she meant it in a way that surprised her with its depth. He stayed in the kitchen while she finished the biscuits, and they ate dinner together and talked more than they usually did, about small things and large ones, about the ranch and the territory and what the railroad coming through might eventually mean, and about whether the Sorrel Prospect had the temperament to be a working cow horse, which Ira doubted and Maggie was prepared to argue about. "He's clever," she said. "He just needs a different approach." "He's got a stubborn streak," Ira said. "Clever things often do," she said, and something in the way she said it made him look at her, and she looked back, and the look lasted a beat too long in a way that was different from the too long look on the train platform, which had been recalibration. This was something else. The summer came on hard and fast, the way desert summers do, burning the air to something brilliant and hot and close, and life on the ranch contracted around the heat with the efficient practicality of people who had learned what the land required. Maggie's skin browned and her hands toughened, and she stopped thinking of herself as someone who was adapting to a place and started thinking of herself as someone who belonged to one. She learned to ride properly. Ira taught her himself, in the early mornings when the air was still cool, and he was a patient teacher, which she had somehow known he would be, correcting her posture and her grip with a steady hand and specific language that never made her feel foolish for not already knowing. She learned on Patience first and then graduated to Cedar, and by high summer she could ride Cedar across the south pasture at a full run and feel the wind and the horse as a single thing, and the joy of it was so physical and so complete that she laughed out loud the first time she managed it, a real laugh, unexpected and uninhibited, and Ira, watching from the fence, stood a little straighter. She saw it. She filed it away. They had their first real argument in July. A man from town had approached Ira about selling 40 acres on the eastern edge of the property, a piece of scrubland that did not support grazing and did not have water, and which Ira had always kept as a buffer between his land and the road. The man was a land speculator connected to the railroad, and the price he offered was fair. Ira was inclined to take it. Maggie thought that was a mistake. She said so at dinner with the directness that had by now become established as her mode, and Ira set down his fork and looked at her with a patient expression that did not quite conceal its own edge. "It's not useful land," he said. "It's not useful land now," she said. "That eastern edge is where the creek spreads during the wet season. If the railroad comes through and they manage the water upstream, that land might become the most important 40 acres you have." "That's a speculation," he said. "Yes," she said, "but so is selling it." They went back and forth about it for the better part of an hour, and it was not a comfortable conversation. It had the heat of two people who both had strong minds and were not used to finding another strong mind in the same room disagreeing with them. Ira was not a man who raised his voice, but his quietness had a quality to it that pushed back, and Maggie had learned that the way to engage with that quality was to be steady rather than louder. In the end, he did not sell the land. He did not tell her she was right. He just didn't sell it. A week later he came in from fencing and said, "I talked to Don Eduardo about the water upstream. His family has seen the creek change 3 times in 40 years. You were right about the eastern edge." "I'm glad you didn't sell it," she said. "So am I," he said. And then he said, "You're the sharpest person I have ever had a conversation with." She looked at him. "That's a large claim." "It's true," he said simply, in the way he said all true things. She felt the warmth of it move through her the way the morning light moved through the clouded window, diffuse and full and entirely real. August brought a celebration at the Ray's ranch, a feast to mark the end of the summer's main work, and half the territory came. Maggie went in her best dress, which she had altered and pressed, and Ira wore his clean jacket and the hat that had seen better years, and which she had come to feel a strong affection for because it was so completely his. The night was full of music, guitars and fiddles, and the particular lively rhythms that came from the blending of the territories, many strands, Mexican and Anglo, and the indigenous influences that were present in everything if you were paying attention. The food was extraordinary, and Rosa Delgado pressed a second plate into Maggie's hands before she had finished the first, and Don Eduardo made a toast in both English and Spanish that was about the land, and the people who belonged to it, and the importance of knowing which things were worth fighting for. Ira asked her to dance. He asked her the way he did most things, simply and without preamble, holding out one hand in the firelight of the Ray's yard, and she took it. He danced the way he did everything, steadily and with full attention, and she discovered that dancing with him was nothing like dancing with anyone she had ever danced with before, because he was fully there, not performing the dance or performing the attention, but actually present in a way that made her feel very clearly seen. They danced twice and then stood at the edge of the firelight with cups of something cool that tasted of lime and agave, and she looked at the stars above the desert and felt him beside her, warm and solid and real, and thought that this was a feeling she had not expected to feel and was not sure what to do with. "I have something I want to say to you," she said. "All right," he said. "I came out here because I had no other choice," she said. "You know that. I'm not pretending otherwise. But I want you to know that it has become something I would choose. If I were given the choice today, knowing what I know now, I would choose this. I would choose the ranch and I would choose you." The silence that followed was different from other silences. It had a different quality, a sort of held breath, a gathering. He turned to look at her, and in the firelight his face was clear and serious, and something she had not seen before was present in it. Something open and direct that reached past the careful distance he kept between himself and the world. "I placed that advertisement because I was practical," he said. "I needed help and I was lonely and I knew I wasn't going to find a woman in this territory who wanted what I had to offer, which wasn't much but was real. I expected someone useful, someone decent. I didn't expect." He stopped. Looked at her with those gray-blue eyes that were made for distance but were focused very close. "I didn't expect to be glad," he said. "In the specific way I have found myself glad. It was not a declaration of love in any conventional sense. It was not pretty language or dramatic gesture. It was Ira Norris telling the truth the way he always did, carefully and completely, and it was the most beautiful thing anyone had ever said to her. I'm glad too," she said, in the same specific way. He reached out and took her hand. Not the formal hand-hold of the dance, not the practical hand-hold of assistance. He held her hand the way you hold something that matters, with full intention and full presence, and they stood together at the edge of the firelight with the New Mexico night enormous and star-filled above them. And neither of them said anything more because there was nothing more that needed saying. September came and brought with it the first real cool of the season, and a problem with the north fence that required Ira and Delgado to spend 3 days in the field. Maggie managed the ranch in his absence with the competence that had been building all summer, feeding and watering and tending, and managing the small daily crises that were part of the life. A loose shoe on Jack, a sick hen, a storm that came up fast one afternoon and required moving the horses to the barn with speed and efficiency. When Ira came back on the 3rd evening, she had supper ready and the horses tended and the house in order, and he walked in and looked around and then at her with that particular look that she had learned to read, the look that was more honest than he probably intended. "Everything all right?" he asked. "Jack needs a farrier," she said. "And the gray hen is recovered, and you need to eat before you do anything else." He sat down and ate, and she sat across from him, and they talked about the fence and the weather and Delgado's plan to bring in more cattle before the winter, and it was entirely ordinary and entirely right. The conversation of two people who had become necessary to each other in the 1,000 small ways that constitute a life shared. After dinner, he helped her clear the table, which he had started doing in August and which she had not commented on because commenting on it would have made it significant in a different way, and she preferred to let it be simply what it was, a man helping, a partnership growing naturally into its own shape. He was washing the dishes and she was drying them, and she was aware of the proximity of him, the particular warmth, when he said, without turning around, "I've been thinking." "About what?" she said. "About what we are," he said, "what I'd like us to be." She set down the dish she was drying and waited. He turned around then, and he was looking at her with the most unguarded expression she had seen on his face, all the careful distance dissolved. "I know we agreed to let this be what it is," he said. "I know the arrangement was practical, but I find I don't want to be practical about this anymore." "What do you want to be?" she asked. "Married," he said, "in the full sense, not just in the arrangement sense." He stopped, and for the first time she saw him struggle with words, the precise economical man reaching for language adequate to what he was feeling and finding that no language is quite adequate. "I want to be your husband," he said, "if you're willing, if you feel." She crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and kissed him. She did it because the language was never going to get there fast enough, and because she had been thinking about it since August, and because he was looking at her with a vulnerability she had not expected from him, and she could not stand to leave it unanswered for another moment. She kissed him the way you do something you have been meaning to do for a long time, with intention and fullness, and he made a small sound that might have been surprise, and then he kissed her back with a thoroughness and a feeling that made her understand that all of that careful quiet had contained something very large and very warm that had been waiting for exactly this. They stood in the kitchen with the dishes half done in the evening outside the window turning deep blue, and when they finally separated she looked up at him and his face was changed, all the distance gone, replaced by something so openly joyful that it transformed him, made him younger somehow, made him the man he must have been before the war took his brother and the farm and the East, the man who had been waiting somewhere underneath the careful quiet for something to call him back out. "Well," he said. "Yes," she said. "All right then," he said and smiled, and it was a full smile, not the almost smile, and it was extraordinary. The autumn was the most beautiful season Maggie had ever lived through. The desert country in the fall had a quality that she could not have imagined in Cincinnati, the air going crisp and clean, the cottonwoods turning a yellow so brilliant it hurt, the mountains to the north developing their first snow on the peaks while the valley below them remained warm in the midday light. The work was satisfying in a way that the work of summer had been satisfying, but differently. The work of harvest and preparation, laying in stores for the winter, putting up the preserved vegetables from the kitchen garden, bringing in extra wood, settling the ranch against the cold that would come. They worked side by side most days and spoke about everything, and nothing with the ease of people who have discovered that conversation between them is a pleasure rather than an obligation. He read to her in the evenings from the books on the shelf, and she discovered that he had a particular voice for reading, low and measured, that made even ordinary prose feel considered. She had her own books, 3 she had brought from Cincinnati, and she read to him in return, and he was a good listener, commenting with the same precision he brought to everything, never performing engagement but always genuinely present. They slept in the same room now. He had moved his things without ceremony one night in early October, and she had made space for them without comment, and that was that. She discovered that he was a man who slept deeply and woke completely, no groggy middle state, just asleep and then awake and already organized, which she found both impressive and somewhat inhuman. She herself took 10 minutes to fully arrive at consciousness, a fact he accommodated by having the coffee made before she came to the kitchen every morning without fail, set in the exact spot she preferred. This was, she thought, what love was actually made of. Not the dramatic moments, though there were those too, but the coffee, placed correctly, every morning. Don Eduardo came by one afternoon in October with a bottle of wine from the Reyes family's own vineyard, an old variety that his grandfather had planted, and he sat at the kitchen table with them and drank it slowly and talked about the land the way he talked about everything, with the patience of someone who has learned to see time in large increments. He had been watching them all summer with his sharp, assessing eyes, and at some point in the afternoon he said, in English, with the formal precision that was his signature, "You have found something worth protecting." He said it to both of them equally, looking from one to the other, and Maggie understood that he was not only talking about the land. "We have," she said. Ira, beside her, put his hand over hers on the table. It was a small gesture, entirely natural, entirely deliberate. Don Eduardo smiled, the smile of a man who has been watching human beings for a very long time and is occasionally glad to find them doing things right. Winter settled in December with a gentleness that Maggie had not expected. She had imagined the desert in winter as cold and barren, but it was cold and clarified, the light having a particular quality in the short days that made everything precise and clean. The mountains stayed visible and white-topped for weeks, and the evenings closed in early and brought with them the particular intimacy of a warm house and a fire and 2 people who had made a life together that fit. She wrote to her aunt in Cincinnati at Christmas, a careful letter that was honest without being unkind. She said that she was well. She said that she was happy in a way she had not known how to be before, that the West had given her something she had not known she was looking for. She said that she did not blame anyone for how she had come to be there, that the accident of Alina's change of heart had given her the exact life she was supposed to have, which she could not have planned and would not trade. Her aunt wrote back that Alina was expecting a child, and that she hoped Maggie's situation was comfortable. Maggie read this with the particular equanimity of someone who has fully outgrown the container they used to live in. She folded the letter and put it in the box and went back to the kitchen where Ira was reading by the fire, and she sat next to him, and he made the unconscious shift toward her that he always made when she sat close, a sort of gravitational acknowledgement, and she leaned against him and looked at the fire. "Are you happy?" he asked. He asked her this with some regularity, not anxiously, but the way he checked all things that mattered to him with steady attention. "I am," she said. "Are you?" "In the specific way we discussed," he said, and she could hear the smile in his voice without needing to look. "That specific way," she confirmed. He pressed his lips to the top of her head, briefly and completely, and went back to his reading, and she sat beside him in the firelight of the house they had made together in the high desert of New Mexico, and felt the warmth of the fire and the warmth of him, and the deep, settled satisfaction of a life that was wholly and truly hers. In February she told him she was expecting a child. She told him at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning over coffee, because she was a direct person, and he was a man who preferred truth in plain words. She watched his face as she said it, watched the information land, watched the sequence of expressions move through him, something like surprise, something like computation, and then something that opened in him so completely and so suddenly that it changed his face the way light changes a room when the shutters are thrown back. He reached across the table and took both her hands. "Are you well?" he asked first, which told her everything about him and about them. "I'm well," she said. "Very well." He held her hands and looked at her with those gray-blue eyes bright with something that was not the careful reserve she had first met but was its opposite, a full and open feeling that he no longer saw any reason to guard. "A child," he said, as if the word needed to be tasted to be believed. "In August, I think," she said. He was quiet for a long moment, still holding her hands, and then he said, "I have wanted this kind of life for a very long time." He said it simply, the way he said all true things. I had almost stopped expecting it. She thought of the title she had given this life in her mind, the way she privately thought of it as the answer to a question she had not known how to ask until she found herself asking it without words. She thought of standing on the train platform in April with her valise and her $40 and her total uncertainty, and she thought of him at the end of that platform, holding his hat, scanning the arrivals with an expression that was carefully neutral but not quite. "I think you were asking for it," she said. Just very quietly, he looked at her. "What do you mean?" "Some people ask loudly," she said, "out into the world openly wanting to be heard. And some people ask very quietly, mostly to themselves, and you have to be close to hear it. I think you were asking. I just happened to be the one who arrived." He was quiet for a long time with that. Then he said, "You weren't an accident, Maggie." "I know," she said. "You were." He stopped, and she could see him working towards something, reaching for the words with the precision of a man who does not want to get this wrong. "Eleanor's loss was not your gain," he said carefully. "You are not a substitute. You are the answer to the thing I was actually asking. I understand that now." She felt the truth of that settle into her like water into dry ground, finding every crack and filling it. "Ira," she said. "Yes," he said. "I love you," she said. He held her hands tighter. His face in the winter morning light was entirely open, entirely present, entirely the face of a man who has no more use for distance. "I love you," he said, and the words were simple and enormous, the way all real things are. Spring came again. Maggie's pregnancy progressed with the same stubborn health that characterized everything she undertook, and she continued working, moderating her activities as necessary without drama, making the adjustments that the situation required. Ira watched over her with the attentiveness of a man who had found something he valued beyond his previous capacity to value, and was navigating the strange territory of that kind of caring, which is both protective and respectful, which wants to shelter, but understands that the person being sheltered is entirely capable of knowing her own limits. Rosa Delgado became her closest friend in the territory. Rosa had 3 children of her own and a 4th on the way, and she came over several times a week, and they talked about everything: the practical matters of frontier pregnancy, and the raising of children in a place that was still partly wild, but also about their lives and histories, and the particular experience of being women in a world that had made very definite ideas about what women were supposed to be, and how thoroughly those ideas missed the point. Rosa had opinions about everything, and expressed them with a warmth and directness that Maggie deeply admired. She had also been in the territory her whole life and knew things about it that no amount of reading could teach, The rhythms of the seasons and the water and the land, the complex social landscape of a place where cultures had been colliding and occasionally combining for generations. "The territory is changing fast," Rosa said one afternoon in April. They were sitting on the porch with cold tea watching Prospect in the near corral, who had developed into a handsome young horse and had vindicated Maggie's assessment of his character entirely. "The railroad will change everything. Not all of it will be bad, but not all of it will be good." "I know," Maggie said. "Ira worries about it." "Don Eduardo worries more," Rosa said. "His family has seen this before, each wave of change." She paused. "The first change took this land from the Apache. The second change made it Mexican. The third change made it American. Each time people lost things that should not have been taken." She looked at Maggie directly. "This land has a weight to it. History lives in the ground here. You cannot own land like this without understanding what it cost." Maggie thought about this with the seriousness it deserved. She thought about Don Eduardo and his grandfather's vineyard, and the generations of the Reyes family who had worked the ground that was now partly the ground she walked on. She thought about the injustice of displacement and the way history was layered in the West like sediment, each era pressing down on the one before it, and about the responsibility of people who had benefited from those layers to see them clearly. "What do you do with that?" Maggie asked. "That knowledge," Rosa thought about it. "You carry it honestly," she said. "You do not pretend it was simple or clean. You treat the people around you as people. You do not take more than you need." She paused. "And you make something real in your own corner of it, something that gives back." Maggie carried that conversation for a long time. She talked about it with Ira that evening, and he listened the way he always listened, fully and carefully. And when she finished, he was quiet for a moment and then said, "Don Eduardo said something to me when I first bought this land. He said the land doesn't belong to us. We belong to it. I've been trying to live that way." "I want it too," she said. He nodded. "I know," he said. "You already are." The summer came on and the baby grew and the ranch continued to thrive. Ira brought in a second ranch hand that spring, a young man named Thomas Bard who was 17 and had come from Missouri looking for work, and was honest and hardworking and hopeless with horses, until Maggie showed him what she had figured out about Prospect's particular temperament. And then he and Prospect became an unlikely working partnership that delighted everyone. She also, that spring, helped 3 neighboring families with deed questions similar to what she had helped Ira with, working with Holly's Pratt in Santa Fe to identify recording irregularities and file the necessary objections. Word spread through the territory the way word spreads in places where news travels by horse and trust, and she found herself increasingly sought out by people who had land questions and did not have access to a lawyer, and who had discovered that Maggie Norris was the kind of woman who would look at a document carefully and tell you the truth of it. She found this work deeply satisfying. She found it particularly satisfying when the people she helped were the people who had the most to lose, the Mexican families, the small homesteaders, the families who had been farming the same land for decades but had never had the paperwork in order because the paperwork system had not existed when their claim was established. She mentioned this to Ira, the way she mentioned everything, directly and over coffee. "I think this is something I could do properly," she said. "Not as a lawyer, but as someone who understands the documents, someone people could come to." He looked at her with that full attention. "You should," he said. "It would take time from the ranch," she said. "The ranch will manage," he said. "Some things are more important." She loved him for that. She loved him for the ease with which he said it, for the complete absence of any suggestion that her time was less valuable than his, or that the work she wanted to do was subordinate to the work of the household. She loved him for the way he had always treated her mind as a gift rather than a complication. "After the baby," she said. "After the baby," he agreed. The baby came on the 15th of August, in the heat of the afternoon, and he came into the world with the loud and vigorous disapproval of someone who found the transition inconvenient. Rosa was there, and the doctor from Santa Fe, and Ira was outside the bedroom door for the entire labor, which was 6 hours, and which he apparently spent going from the porch to the kitchen and back in a pattern that Thomas Bard told her afterward had worn a visible path in the dirt. When Rosa brought the baby out and put him in Ira's arms, Maggie heard the silence from the other side of the door, and then she heard Ira's voice, low and entirely stripped of its careful reserve, saying something she could not make out but which had a quality that made her close her eyes with the full weight of her own happiness. He brought the boy in and sat on the edge of the bed and held him between them, and the baby, who had been registering his protests loudly, went quiet in that position, as if the particular combination of their warmth was something he recognized. "What shall we name him?" Maggie asked. Ira looked at the baby for a long time. Then he said, "James, after my brother." She had not suggested it. It was entirely his, but it was the exactly right thing, and she knew it without needing to deliberate. "James," she said, "James Norris." Ira looked up from the baby to her face with an expression that was so unguarded and so complete that she felt it like something physical. "Thank you," he said. "For all of it, for coming out here. I was sent as an afterthought," she reminded him gently. "No," he said. He said it quietly and with absolute certainty. "No, whatever those people thought when they put you on that train, whatever they believed about the value of you, they were wrong about it in every possible sense. You were not an afterthought. You were the whole answer." He looked at the baby in his arms and then back at her. "I just didn't know what the question was until you arrived." She put her hand against his face, against the weathered, interesting face she had been reading for months like a language she was still learning and would spend the rest of her life happily studying. He leaned into her hand the way Cedar leaned into her hand when she stroked him, with the full trusting weight of it. "I know what it was now," she said. "What?" he said. "The question," she said. "You were asking for a home, a real one, not just a house or a piece of land, the kind that has someone in it who knows you." He was quiet. "And I was asking for the same thing," she said. "I just didn't know it until I found it." James made a small sound between them, the small vowel of a new person discovering that the world is large and warm and already full of interesting things to say. Ira shifted him gently and looked at his face with the absolute focused attention that was his most essential quality, and Maggie watched them, her husband and her son, in the amber light of a New Mexico August afternoon, and felt the life she was in as a complete and solid and irreplaceable thing. The years that followed were full ones. James grew with the confidence of a child who has always known he is wanted, and he was from the very beginning a combination of both of them. He had Ira's quietness and his habit of observing before acting, and Maggie's quickness and her inability to leave an interesting problem alone. He was on a horse by the time he was 4, a small tidy pony named Biscuit that Ira had acquired from the Ray's family, and he took to it with the inevitability of a child for whom horses were simply part of the landscape of existence. The work Maggie had begun with land documents grew into something genuine and purposeful. Working with Hollis Pratt as a formal partner, she spent 2 days a week in his Santa Fe office reviewing deeds and land grants, and over the following years, they helped dozens of families establish or protect legitimate claims to their land. The work was not dramatic and it was not celebrated, but it was real and it mattered, and the people it helped knew it mattered, and that was enough. Don Eduardo, when he heard what she was doing in full scope, came to the ranch with another bottle of his grandfather's wine and sat at the kitchen table and said, in his formal and precise English, "You are paying a debt you did not personally incur. That is the rarest kind of honesty." "Someone has to," she said. "Very few do," he said. Ira, beside her, said nothing, but his hand found hers under the table. In the fall of 1876, Maggie told Ira she was expecting their second child. He received this news with the same depth of joy he had received the first time, though he was more practiced now at the particular management of that joy, which in him expressed itself as an increase in attentiveness and a decrease in his already limited interest in going anywhere without her. "You know I can still ride Cedar," she said. "I know," he said. You don't have to walk Cedar yourself every time I ride. I'm not walking him, he said. I happen to be going the same direction. She gave him a long look. He gave her back a perfectly composed expression that contained, somewhere in it, that smile. Ira, she said. Maggie, he said. I love you, she said. That's fortunate, he said, and the smile arrived fully, the real one, the one that had been there all along waiting for the right conditions, because I have no intention of being anywhere you're not for the rest of my natural life. The second baby was a girl, which James received with the philosophical acceptance of a boy who has been raised in a household where women are clearly the ones who get things done, and therefore assumed his new sister would be useful. They named her Clara, and she arrived in April of 1877 with the spring and the wildflowers and the particular clarity of a New Mexico morning after rain. And she had Maggie's brown eyes and Ira's steady demeanor and a grip on your finger, right from the beginning, that suggested she intended to hold on. James looked at her in Maggie's arms with the serious expression that was so entirely his father's face on a smaller scale that Maggie had to look away for a moment because the love of it was almost too much. She's very small, James said. She was just born, Maggie said. Will she be useful, he asked. Eventually, Maggie said. All right, James said, and accepted this with the patience of a boy who understood about eventually. Ira, who was standing at the window with the look he sometimes got at the particular moments of life, the look that was past happiness and was something quieter and deeper, turned around and looked at the three of them, his wife and his son and his new daughter, and Maggie looked back at him, and the look between them carried everything it needed to carry without a single word. By 1878, the railroad had arrived in New Mexico territory, and Don Eduardo's predictions about the way it would change things began to prove accurate in both the good and the difficult ways. The good was the access it brought, mail and goods in connection to the wider world. The difficult was the new wave of speculation and the new pressures on land that the railroad interests brought with them, and Maggie's work with Hollis Pratt became more urgent and more necessary as the pressure on small landholders increased. She had become, in the territory, a kind of quiet institution. People came to her the way people come to someone they have learned to trust, with their problems and their documents and their uncertainty, and she received them at the kitchen table or at the office in Santa Fe with the same practical honesty she had brought to everything. She could not fix every wrong. The system had too many of them, and she was one woman with limited legal authority in a time that barely acknowledged women's legal standing at all. But she could find the fixable wrongs, and she could press on them with the particular steady pressure that she had learned was more effective than loudness. Ira came to Santa Fe with her one day in late 1878, a day when she had a particularly complicated case involving 3 families and a railroad land agent who had been filing claims against occupied land, and he sat in the back of Pratt's office and watched her work through the afternoon, and on the way home on the buckboard with the sun going down behind the mountains he said, "You are extraordinary." She looked at him. "I don't say it enough," he said. "I should say it more. You are extraordinary, and I want to make sure you know I see that." "I know you see it," she said. "I want to say it," he said, clearly. She leaned her head against his shoulder on the buckboard, the way she had learned to fit herself against him, and felt the warmth of him and the steady rhythm of Cedar and Jack on the road and the enormous sky above them going through its daily performance of beauty. "You see me, Ira," she said. "That's the whole of it. You have always seen me." He put his arm around her and they drove home in the last of the light, through the scrubland and the cottonwoods and the red dust, toward the low adobe house with its wide porch and its kitchen garden, and the smell of sage and warm earth that was, by now, the smell of home in every sense the word could carry. James was on the porch when they arrived, waiting with the particular patience of a 7-year-old who has learned that patience is valued in this household and has decided to demonstrate it. Clara was inside with Rosa, who had been staying with the children in their absence. "Papa," James said, coming to take Cedar's bridle with the seriousness of a boy who took his responsibilities seriously. "Thank you, James," Ira said, climbing down and lifting Maggie down after him in a gesture so habitual by now that neither of them thought about it but which was always, in some small way, the same. Maggie went inside and found Clara on Rosa's lap, already asleep, with the complete abandon of a 1-year-old who falls asleep in the middle of whatever she is doing without apology. "Good day?" Rosa asked. "A good day," Maggie said. Outside she could hear Ira and James talking about the horses, the low murmur of it, the easy exchange between a father and a son who spoke the same language of attentiveness. She listened to it and held it the way you hold something you know is precious, with all your attention and without gripping. Rosa watched her face. "You look like a woman who has everything she needs," she said. "I do," Maggie said simply. "That is not common," Rosa said. "Do not let it go unnoticed." "I notice it every day," Maggie said. The evening gathered around the ranch the way evenings gathered in that country, with grandeur and silence, the sky going from gold to amber to violet to the full star-crowded dark that never failed to stop her, even after years. She stood on the porch after supper and looked at it, the same porch she had stood on in her first weeks here trying to figure out what kind of person she was supposed to be, and she knew now. She had learned it through the work and the love and the children and the land and the particular education that comes from choosing, every day, to be fully present in the life that is yours. She had been sent west as an afterthought of other people's convenience, a placeholder for an arrangement that had been someone else's plan. She had arrived with a second-hand valise and $40 in her corset and no confidence in the outcome and every willingness to make something real regardless. And Ira Norris, who had been standing at the end of a train platform in the amber evening of Santa Fe, holding his hat with the absent-minded grip of a man who had taken it off out of habit and forgotten he was holding it, scanning the arrivals with an expression that was carefully neutral but not quite, had received her not as a substitute and not as a solution to a practical problem, but as something he had not known he was looking for until she arrived and made it clear. The question he had been asking quietly, mostly to himself, was the question she was the answer to. And the question she had been asking, in the part of herself that could not be silenced by being made inconvenient or expendable or easily dispatched to the far side of the country, was the question he answered by being exactly who he was, steady and honest and attentive, a man who read by the fire and named his horses and made her coffee every morning and meant every word he ever said. Ira came out onto the porch and stood beside her. "Children are in bed," he said. "Already," she said. James negotiated for one more story. Clara negotiated to sleep on his feet, which he found objectionable but accepted. Maggie smiled into the dark. He stood beside her and looked at the stars. She leaned against him and he put his arm around her shoulders, and they stood in the quiet of the New Mexico night with everything they had built around them and between them and ahead of them. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "The train platform," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "What about it?" "The look on your face," she said. "When you first saw me, I've been thinking about it since that night." "What look?" he asked. "The look of a man recalibrating," she said, "deciding whether to proceed." He thought about this with the honesty he brought to all self-examination. "Yes," he said, "I was recalibrating." "And now," she said, he turned her toward him. In the dark his face was clear, the weathered, interesting face she knew better than any face in the world, with its careful lines and its gray-blue eyes that held the distance and the depth in equal measure, and the smile that had always been there waiting for the conditions to be right. "Now I know that recalibration was the best thing I have ever done," he said. "Now I know that whatever I thought I was asking for when I placed that advertisement, what I was actually asking for was you. Specifically. The real thing, and not a version of it." He cupped her face in both his hands, those large, steady hands that had lifted her trunk from a train platform in 1873 and built fences and held his children and held her, all with the same full and careful attention. "You are not an afterthought, Maggie. You are the main text. She put her hands over his. And you, she said, are the answer to something I had been asking since before I knew I was asking it. He kissed her under the stars of the New Mexico Territory in the spring of 1878, with the sound of the horses settling in the barn and the smell of sage and the distant howl of a coyote somewhere in the hills, and the kitchen light coming warm through the window of their house. And it was a kiss that contained all the months and all the miles and all the particular education of two people who had been sent to each other by accident and had chosen each other every day since. In the summer of 1879, they planted a new section of the kitchen garden on the east side, larger than before, to accommodate the addition they had recently confirmed. Maggie was 30 years old and healthy and entirely practical about the prospect of another child, and James was 9, and had already informed them that if it was a boy he was willing to share biscuit, and if it was a girl he would require negotiation. And Clara, who was 2 and had opinions about everything, had announced simply that the baby should be named after her, which no one had the heart to directly contradict. Ira built a new room onto the south side of the house that summer, working in the evenings after the day's ranch work with Thomas Bard, who had grown into a young man of 23 and had become as much a part of the ranch as the horses, and who was, Maggie had recently noticed, making increasingly frequent trips to the Ray's ranch, where Don Eduardo's granddaughter Maria had recently come to stay after her schooling in Santa Fe. She mentioned this to Ira one evening with a diplomatic subtlety that she immediately abandoned in favor of direct statement. Thomas and Maria Rays, she said. Ira looked up from his coffee. I think something is developing there, she said. He was quiet for a moment. I noticed, he said, you didn't say anything. Neither did you, he said, until now. I wanted to see if you noticed. I notice things, he said. You do, she agreed. She had long since stopped being surprised by the depth of his observation, which was quiet but total. Thomas is a good man, Ira said. Maria seems remarkable, Maggie said. I've spoken with her twice. She has a mind. Then they'll do well, he said, with the simple certainty of a man who believed that good people with good minds could build good things if given the chance, which was a belief that his own life had proven out, and which he therefore held without qualification. The third baby arrived in December of 1879, a boy with Maggie's dark hair, and a set of opinions that he began registering immediately. They named him Edward, after Don Eduardo, who received the news with the precise and formal dignity of a man who is deeply moved and has extensive practice at not showing it, and then showed it anyway, briefly, at the kitchen table over the wine he brought, in the form of a single tear that he did not bother to wipe away. James accepted Edward with the magnanimity of an older brother, who has had the time to develop philosophical positions about siblings. Clara, who was 2.5 and had not gotten the baby named after her, examined Edward for several long minutes and then announced that he would do, which everyone agreed was high praise. The winter of 1879 was cold and clear, and the ranch was warm and full, and on the last evening of the year, Maggie sat in the front room with the fire going and Edward asleep in the cradle Ira had made, and James and Clara in bed and Ira beside her with his book, and she looked around the room at all of it, the firelight and the children sleeping, and the man who had built this room with his own hands and was reading by the light he had created in it. And she thought that she had arrived at a place that was completely hers, not given to her, not arranged for her, not the destination of an afterthought, hers. Built from her own hands and her own mind and her own willingness to be fully present in whatever life she was standing in. And his, and theirs, the thing they had made between them from practical arrangement and honest language and the daily accumulation of coffee placed correctly, and arguments about land and kisses in the kitchen and children named after brothers and daughters who negotiated and sons who accepted with the patience of their father. She looked at Ira. He felt her looking and looked up from his book. Thank you, she said. For what? He said. For being the kind of person I could build something real with, she said. He set down the book. He looked at her with the full attention that was his primary gift to the world and to her. The same, he said, entirely the same. Outside the window, the last night of 1879 was clear and cold and full of stars, and the New Mexico territory was exactly as large and as luminous, and as full of everything as it had always been. The land that had witnessed generations and would witness more, that carried its history in the ground and its future in the sky, and asked only that the people who belonged to it carry both honestly. Maggie Norris, who had arrived on a train platform with a second-hand valise and $40 in her corset and a letter written to someone else, looked out at the stars and felt the weight of the ring on her hand and the warmth of the man beside her and the sound of her children sleeping in the house they had all made together. And she thought that the best things in life are not the things that are planned for you. They are the things you find by accident and then choose every day until they become the truest thing you know. She had been sent west as an afterthought. She had arrived as the answer, and the question, it turned out, had always been worth asking.